So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bartlett Guest Seminar Series, Speculative Design. This is a roundtable seminar that discusses the meaning, impact, and applications of speculation in design. So every seminar, we will be inviting guests from all over the world within various disciplines to discuss a sub-theme. Today, we have three very, very special guests from outside of the field of architecture to speak with us, Valdis, Gleb, and Lisa. But before I introduce them, just a heads up that next week on Monday, we will have a seminar on collaborative intelligence. Thank you. Focusing on multi-agent distributed systems of humans and machines that contribute to a problem-solving network, a crowdsourcing ecosystem to aggregate individual expertise, preferences, and contributions. But without further ado, let's begin with today's seminar. So we invited three guests to discuss the relationship between speculation and strategic foresight in the context of urban design. They will map the contemporary trends in risk and lifecycle management, policy design and AI ethics, regulatory sandboxes, and microeconomics, and their impacts on the future of urbanism. So unfortunately, Nanshin has an emergency, so she won't be joining us today. Nonetheless, first we will have Gleb Papyshev, who is a PhD candidate at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and a scholar at the Oxford Russia Fellowship Program. He studies science and technology policy, and his research projects mainly deal with governance and regulation of AI. He's also a part of the design collective Presence. Lisa Dorrer is a researcher in architecture, urbanism, and emerging technologies. She studied speculative urbanism at Strelka Institute and worked as a tutor at Strelka's New Normal program and terraforming program. Currently, Lisa is a PhD candidate in public policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology with a focus on urban technology regulation. Also, she is a co-curator of the Russian Pavilion at Venice Biennale. Last but not least, we have Valdis Silins, who is a strategic foresighter and writer with a background in cultural theory, working at the intersection of emerging technologies, politics, and designs. He holds a master's degree in film and moving image studies from Concordia University and a Bachelor of Cultural Studies from McGill University, a very interdisciplinary background. So without further ado, let's give it applause to Gleb.
All right. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Can you see it?
Yes. Ooh,
right.
Hot.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you, Provides, for inviting me to participate in this seminar, and thank you for introducing me. So when I got this invitation, I thought, what kind of topics can be relevant to discuss in a seminar like that? And I came up with this little, not a lecture, but rather a small talk, which we can discuss certain ideas, and I titled it Speculative Evidence. And that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to start with perhaps defining what speculative design is for me. And as Provides mentioned in the beginning, I'm not an architect. I'm not a designer per se myself. I study public policy, and perhaps my only pure relation to anything design-wise was when in my time at Strelka, and when I did several design projects about design after the Strelka. But so today I want to talk about how I understand speculative design and what it is in my practice, and how it somehow affects different things that I am touching upon in whatever I do. So as you probably know, there are numerous different definitions to what speculative design is, and I'm not going to participate in the theoretical discussions about it, rather just give my own understanding of what it can be. And putting it in very simple words, I myself understand it as something of a practice of imagining possible futures without empirical evidence. So now I want to go somehow one by one through all of the words that I'm using in this definition, because I think it somehow gives us an idea and gives an idea for me to talk about the things that will come up later in this talk, but also gives a certain background to this issue. So, and the first word that I'm using here is possible, and I think possible is a very peculiar word in relation to speculative design, because at one hand it means something that may happen, but at the same time it means something that can be done. So it has this modality of potency in it. And I think that's very interesting in terms of speculation and speculative design, because it shows us that this process can not only be about picturing what the future is like and fortune telling what is going to be, future telling what is going to happen in the future, but at the same time it somehow gives you certain agency to try to influence that future that is coming upon you. So the second word is future itself, and the future is perhaps the most difficult of the words that I'm using here. And I'm giving it three definitions. First of all, it's the time to come. So perhaps certain period or era that is coming upon us in the future. It can also mean events that are going to happen. But at the same time, it also has this image of progressive development of humanity. So for example, when we look at sci-fi or whatever, and we see these pictures of the future itself sometimes refers to something like that. So, and I think in relation to speculative design, all of the definitions that I'm trying to put here are always challenged by different speculative design projects. And that's perhaps one of the key features of what speculative design is for me, is trying to challenge the essence of what future is and what it can be. And the last one, perhaps the most unusual word in a sense, when it comes to the discussion of speculative design. And for me, it's empirical evidence. And I do social sciences, and I'm writing a PhD on regulation of artificial intelligence. So for me, causal relationships and empirical evidence is something that you have to pay attention to. And I understand it very simple. It is a proof that something is true. So it means that a certain causal relation exists. And if A happens, then B happens always, and things like that. And without the need to doubt the scientific methods per se, there are obviously matters and situations for which no empirical evidence exists, or perhaps no empirical evidence can ever exist. And I think that these matters and situations is when the speculative design comes in handy. So, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, in an ideal situation, an empirical evidence comes from experiments. It is best if it's not coming from a simple experiment, but rather from a randomized controlled trial, which means that the subject of the experiment are allocated to the treatment and no treatment groups on a random basis. And experiments are usually conducted when a certain hypothesis exists, meaning that there is some evidence about certain situation and people have a hypothesis that certain thing can happen because they have some evidence for that. But in order to test that hypothesis, they have to run an experiment and to confirm whether the hypothesis is true or not, and whether these causal relations or certain things that they expect to happen in the world actually happen. And if you do it successfully, you can understand whether your hypothesis is true or not. However, as I mentioned before, for many phenomena in the world, it is simply impossible to run an experiment, but it's possible to hypothesize something. And I think that's at least how I understand speculative design, is where it operates, where you have certain things, certain trends, and certain evidence that gives you some reason to hypothesize certain things. But in order to understand whether your hypothesis is actually true or not, there is just no way to test things like that. So, but the problem of not actually having evidence about something, and not being able to get that evidence, but still having to make certain decisions and make certain steps is not only exist in the domain of speculative design. I studied public policy, and in policy, everyone has recently become obsessed with a thing called evidence-based policy, which means that policies should be made on scientific evidence or any other type of evidence, not on the gut feelings of certain policymakers or public servants or whatever. And in its essence, I think it's a very good thing if all of the policies were actually happening like that. But in reality, there are many situations where certain evidence on which the policy can be made simply does not exist. So, and I think, COVID-19 and the beginning of the pandemic is a very vivid example of what I'm talking about, because when the pandemic started, most of the countries simply had no idea, no evidence about what this pandemic is bringing upon them, in terms of whether masks are actually helping to stop the spread of the pandemic, whether, for how long people have to quarantine and things like that. And but the decisions about that had still to be made, and the decisions that had to be made were affecting many people who were living in places like that. Okay, so unfortunately, situations like this, when evidence is simply not there, are not only associated with the times of emergency, when the things that no one was expecting are happening. There are many fields where the evidence about certain things is not there, but the things themselves are. So, I'm working with the regulation of emerging technologies, and that's one of the things like that. Putting simple, AI is here. It's on every smartphone. And during the pandemic, you probably interacted with it more often than you interacted with other people. But the industry itself is still pretty much not regulated at all. And regulators around the world are struggling with how to approach this object of regulation. On one hand, the so-called Chernobyl of AI hasn't yet happened, and the true dangers of this technology are not known to anybody. But on the other hand, the technology seems to be working quite effectively in different domains, applicable, generating revenues for companies, economic activities around that. So why regulate it at all? But for me, the question of regulation is usually not about the actual effects that the object of regulation can have or not have in the future, but rather on the policy tools and mechanisms that are put in place when regulating something. So in the field of AI, due to the novelty of the issue and lack of any idea of how to approach the thing, the first response of the community and the governments was to allow the industry to self-regulate itself through different codes of AI ethics or codes of conduct. And we all know self-regulation was once a very popular thing in the financial industry. So it's not very hard to guess why many people are skeptical about Facebook's ability to self-regulate. So, now different countries are discussing stricter approaches to AI regulations, and the European Union even released the so-called AI Artificial Intelligence Act in late April this year, where they try to put a strong and a thorough framework for the regulation of this technology in the future, and it's a draft for now. But still, some steps are taken in that direction. And in this big document, one of the key proposals which they are making, and which, in my opinion, somehow relates to the speculation and speculative design is the so-called regulatory sandboxes. So the European Union is introducing regulatory sandboxes, which are experimental regulatory regimes where companies can test different technological solutions on the market under the supervision of regulatory authorities without the need to comply with the existing regulations. So for me, this approach is very speculative in nature because both the governments and the technological companies are not very sure what they can do with this technology. So because of that, they try to create this safe space where the companies can still experiment with the technological tools while the governments are trying to figure out how to regulatory approach them and experiment with what regulation is in this regards. So, and coming back to the empirical evidence that we were discussing before, another important feature of empirical evidence is that it helps us to predict certain things that will happen in this future because certain causal relations are being observed and proved. And prediction is also surprisingly one of the key features of artificial intelligence and technology, and perhaps the main reason why it's becoming so popular in many different industries. However, making a prediction about something is very dependent on the data about a certain phenomenon, just as the evidence very dependent on the data about it. So when it comes to computer-generated predictions, currently there are two major ways to work with it. The first one is the so-called rules-based approach, where you try to create rules about the system's behavior and then test how it would react and behave under different situations. But the downside of this approach is that the more complex the system gets, the harder it is for you to understand what its rules are. So the accuracy of your predictions decrease with the complexity of the system. While the second approach, mainly reliant on deep learning and machine learning, is when you have a massive of data and you try to derive the future state of a certain thing based on the data that you have. But the limitations of this approach is that you are constrained by the historical data you have. So in that sense, you are relying on an idea that if something was happening before, then it will happen in the future. If there's a historical pattern for something, then it will repeat itself in the future, which may not necessarily be the case. And we cannot guarantee that will always be the case. So, coming back to speculative design as a practice, I guess, Project Presence, which I was and perhaps am part of still, was, we started it at the Strelka Institute with my friends, me on the very left, a younger version of me, Igor, Artyom, and Sveta. And I think we were somehow trying to approach the issues that I was talking about in my presentation. So here's provides actually the major actress in that project. So in that project, we were speculating on the technology of digital twins, and we tried to imagine what would happen if you create a predictive model of your own behavior based on the data that you generate, and how would you interact with a digital twin like that? Would you listen to its predictions or not? Would you try to avoid those predictions? But no matter what you do, the digital twin would become smarter and understand you better and better. And on top of that, we were trying to imagine if you could create digital twins and populate other cities with the replicas of yourselves. And if the actions that you take in one city they would affect the behavior of your digital twin in another city and how you would react to situations like that. And finally, we did a second installment of this film where we were elaborating on the ideas on these ideas a bit more. And we were trying to think what would happen if digital twins of you were not just copies of you, but somehow commodities which you can trade and train. And when we say train, we mean that you could create the digital copies of your behavior for certain purposes that can be traded with someone. So a data set of a certain human behavior that someone wants. So we were thinking about that, and coming all the way back to the idea of speculative evidence, I think in a sense what we were trying to make and do with presence was to create this speculative evidence about the possible futures that may happen, but not necessarily there yet, and for which there is no evidence, but they're still possible. And I think that'd be it for me. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion between let's say, designerly thinking and apply it in policy in a roundtable later. But before that, let us welcome Lisa.
Hey.
Hey.
So I think I'm gonna kind of make, it will be a good connection, of course, to Gleb's talk, because I also study public policy right now. But actually, I started as an architect a while ago. So today I wanna kind of think about what will happen if speculative designer, scientist, and a policymaker walk into a bar. And to tell this anecdote, I think I will tell a little bit about myself, because it will kind of define the lens through which I'm looking into these three areas. And so I started as an architect, and I worked as an architect for 4 or 5 years, doing normal design like interiors, exteriors, and so on, and slowly moved. I was curious about bigger scale, and also was keen on analytical work. So I moved into urban scale and analytical studies at urban scale. And then the major shift happened when I got accepted to Strelka Institute. And so I studied there for a while, and my final project was, of course, related to the urban scale and studies, but it was a speculative urbanist program. So my final project, called Shift, was dealing with automation, labor, and unions. And the final proposition of the project was how to achieve economically distributed automation for truck drivers. And here you see a truck driver from Dagestan in his self-driving truck. And this is a long story, but this is what happened to me as an architect. And then it changed many things in my life. Then I jumped into also Strelka, but Strelka KB, which is an urban consultancy in Moscow. And I, along with 200 people, we were working also on urban scale, but in more analytical kind of way. And the major project I participated in there was a set of 8 books, which were policy recommendations, like things which will inform policies for urban development in Russia. The project was called The Standard for Urban Development in Russia. So I jumped into policy kind of discourse at that time. And also, in parallel with the urban consultancy, I stayed in the Strelka Institute and was a tutor for the New Normal cohort of 2019. You can find many people here whom you know, like Valdis, whom you know pretty soon, and Gleb, and provides too. So there was a layer on top of this kind of normal analytical work. On top of that, I had a lens of speculative design all the way along. Then was terraforming, which ended up looking more like this because of the last year situation. But anyways, now I moved to Hong Kong to do PhD in public policy, but I've changed the field, but I am focusing on urban technology. And this adds another layer of science, in particular for me, social science, on top of everything else. And this is an interesting journey I'm taking right now. And in parallel, as Provides mentioned, I'm a co-curator for Russian Pavilion on Venice Biennale this year. And this is a very complex and multifaceted project with a book and a website and many, many things. But also there is a layer of investigation into digital gaming environments, which is speculative, but I would say by definition, but some projects are intentionally speculative. But in general, you know, the capacity of games to simulate the rules of the world where we live in provides you a power to kind of slightly shift these rules, you know, and see what outcome you will get. So it's a kind of I see it as a like a speculative design coming back into my life with this project. So to sum up, this is how like I ended up with having different perspectives at the moment, and now I will kind of talk through this lens to see how speculative design and the critical approach of speculative design can work, and what other components we need and want to bring about some change. So when I explain what speculative design is to my friends, I usually use just a small, I'm not using a quote, but I would say that you know that design solves the problem, right? And the speculative design actually creates a question, and this is the major product of speculative design. I think it sums up pretty much for me what it means. And of course, it's a quote from Anthony Dune and Fayan Rabi. So this is about speculative design. What speculative design lacks of most cases of speculative design is what science have. The capacity of thorough research, the capacity of building on top the knowledge that was built through kind of large amount of time. And this is not science I'm doing, but this is a scientist from my university. My social sciences mates look more like this, and this time's more like this. It's all of us these days. But anyways, so the science, at least what I've learned about science participating in this this year, so the science stands upon two pillars of research questions and data. These are the two components you need to start the research, right? And about the data, Gleb told you about what other specific requirements for data with which science is struggling. Like you need an evidence, right? You need something, either create some data or have some data, some evidence from past, right? But this is a slightly different topic. I want to focus on research question. And I found that for academia, for science, how you find the research question is actually, it's not that kind of obvious how this question arises. So I would say it's more or less gap filling. You would build on top of the, which is good. You will build on experience, on the knowledge, on the research of your fellow research mates, on the kind of academic community, that you find what was not studied, and then you focus on it and fill this gap. This is great, and this is what for speculative design kind of not existent. This why I think this is a perfect match between the, not only me, this why critical approach of speculative design is a great component to match with the research capacities of science in kind of this, you know, feedback loop relationship, when research informs the scientific research informs the speculative design speculative designers with the data, with knowledge, and then due to the critical approach of speculative design, it helps to formulate the questions that might move the research further, and this kind of loops. And I like the, of course, it's not my thinking, it's based on some other thinkers, and if you haven't read the article of Benjamin Bratton on speculative design, I highly recommend you to do so. And one of his quotes from there are, like, he's talking about that in general in research and in kind of science and technology studies, engineering capacity really lacks of critical capacity, and they should go hand in hand. And design and art and humanities are actually necessary to realize the full potential of emerging technology and innovation. And I really agree with him. Of course, it's not something that something new. It's how in many parts speculative design is actually being done in general as an approach. So Anthony Dune and Fiona Rabi, they run a studio in RCA, and there they propose to the students to actually pick a research field and see what questions there are kind of overlooked, for example, or what consequences should be addressed in a critical way. And one of the projects, it's too long to explain in this time frame, but they deal with kind of nanoparticles and how they are used in different applications, and also in geoengineering, and how it relates to weather, like cloud seeding and geoengineering and changing of weather. What's important in this project is that not only that they collaborated with real, this is ongoing investigation. It was ongoing, I guess, a year ago, at least. And they were talking to the scientists all the time. And they like step by step, the project was enriched by this conversation, which I think is important. What's more important is this ice cream truck, which the students decided to use to reach out to a wider audience. So they were talking about geoengineering, but also they at some point discovered that nanoparticles actually can enhance the texture of an ice cream, and they combined these two things, and they went out with this ice cream truck to preach or to talk to citizens about the consequences of geoengineering. And why they did this? Because both speculative design and academia, they have something in common, which is that both operate in rather closed bubbles, and it's very hard to reach out outside of these bubbles. So in academia, in science, we stay in mostly in our conferences, and within this academic papers exchange. In art and speculative design, it stays mostly within the exhibitions. Of course, there are mechanisms how to, and of course they work how, like scientific consultants work for government and for companies, and how, and of course, normal people go to the exhibitions, but still they have their own languages, and it's really hard to take out what they're doing. And even with when we marry these two bubbles together, they stay in just a bigger bubble, which is not really productive. So what is lacking here to make this actually matching kind of fields together? What's lacking to make a change? And I study public policy, and I think it's public policy actually, because the policy is what actually makes change. We can say that we should change our behaviors, but actually no, it's a bigger things that should change. To, I don't know, I'm not too specific here, but we can think of the same AI problem or the climate change, many different kinds of ecological problems. But the policy is that component which should be informed by the union of the fields of speculative design and research. And taking this a bit further and taking the policy angle on this, it seems like it deserves to be institutionalized. We know such examples of MIT labs, for example, where they bring together designers and scientists and they do something together, and they have created this ecosystem where it works. And there is ecosystem between the research and policy. It's arguable how well it works, but still it's there is some specific body and organization and institution around this collaboration. So I would argue that we should think more of, and I hope to take this things further to establish the protocols of collaboration between those three. So answering, so kind of giving an end to this anecdote, I think that when speculative designer and scientist and policymaker would walk into a bar, I think they will bring about change, and I really hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. I really like this imagery that you put into our brain. But actually, I think real communication comes in a more complex texture than this. And I think we should really have a conversation about this interdisciplinary collaboration.
This is something to discuss, for sure.
Yes. Okay, let us now welcome our last guest, Valdis.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for the talks, Lisa and Gleb. That was very interesting. And I think there's like a lot of overlap and a lot of ability to kind of generously think together, as well as mercilessly attack. I'm kidding. So sorry, let me just get this into full screen. So this kind of short presentation is going to be on, I guess, the intersection of where I work, which is kind of a thing called strategic design and strategic foresight and speculative design. I'll add that I, in general, tend to be critical of both of those terms. I think all strategy involves foresight. I think all design involves speculation. I also think the two things overlap. All strategy involves design, and all speculation involves a kind of like pragmatic strategic approach. So I think like the terms that we use do matter, but for the sake of like ease of understanding, we'll just move forward with those terms in mind. So this cover image, Navigating Uncertainty, the image behind there, I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but it kind of became famous around a few years ago. It actually is the Goldman Sachs building that's lit up there in the back during Hurricane Sandy. It was the only building that managed to have its generators located in a place where the flooding caused by the hurricane didn't actually cause it to go out. And so it functions as this kind of funny synecdoche type image of what speculation in the modern world mostly looks like, the one that we're most familiar with, the one that shapes our world probably in the most ways, which is the kind of quite limited financial speculation that at least, that's guided the world for who knows how long. And I think this kind of talk is not like to contest that approach, but actually maybe we can think about using some of the tools that they use to try to imagine other kinds of futures as well. So I'll skip this. I was kind of introduced. I kind of have a background in strategic foresight. I've been at Strelco with some of these other people on the panel, and now I'm part of like a kind of small network collective that's trying to do something a little different. And I'll just add that I think a key term for me is actually like pragmatic speculations. And so to me, these two things, pragmatism and speculation, are not opposed. They're just kind of different sides of the same process. And so every strategy and every design engages in sort of this two-handed approach. And it depends on what perspective you want to take at any given moment, whether you think of it as pragmatic or as speculative. But I think it's useful to think of it as a cycle, as some of the images that were sort of shown in the other presentations like alluded to, there's a kind of back and forth between processes of like framing a problem and then actually trying to identify solutions to it, which then in turn sort of reframe what that problem was initially, right? And so that action of actually doing something in the world changes what you thought the thing that you were doing was. And so there's always a back and forth between these two in a kind of process. And so I'm going to start with a distinction that's a bit simplified, and it's long been around, but this distinction between complicated and complex, which comes out of a kind of systems thinking tradition that, you know, is at least since the 1950s, as I understand it, has been around. And there's other ways you can classify subcategories within each of these, but at a very basic level, there's kind of, you can think two big buckets in which we think of like processes that go on in the world. There's kind of the complicated bucket, which means that there are a series of components that are kind of discrete, linear, relatively predictable. In this case, I'm showing an image of an engine. You know, you put gasoline into the engine, you know that the spark plug sort of launches that gas into the, or ignites that gas in the piston, which like launches creates the energy that drives the engine forward. And the way the engine operates is relatively predictable. You know, if you have an engine that gives about 150 horsepower, that's what you're going to get, you know, 2 months from now. It's what you're going to get a year from now, you know, barring some kind of like breakdown in the system. There's not really that much variation as to like what that system produces as an outcome. Complex systems, on the other hand, are a little more non-linear, a little bit more non-deterministic. They're maybe a little more open in terms of how we define them, which means that the kinds of things that filter into the system that affect it are a little bit wider. And so the kind of things that can affect the weather tend to be a sort of, there's a wider group of things that enter into how that system operates and emerges. And also what the kind of outcomes that it has are. And so I think a good way of thinking about the distinction between these two systems is to kind of realize that if an engine, a mechanical engine, operated like the weather, it would mean that, you know, a week from now, that engine might give you 600 horsepower or something like that, the equivalent of like a hurricane, which is just clearly not the case. There's some kind of like distinction between these two at a very high level we can think of existing, if only our approach to these particular systems at the present moment, given what knowledge we have of it. So related to this distinction between sort of complicated and complex is the kinds of outcomes that these two systems produce and the kinds of things that you have to be aware of when you're dealing with these sort of different kinds of systems, whether that's like from a strategic perspective or a design perspective. On the one hand, there's risk, and on the other, there's uncertainty. And this is like a distinction that goes back to Frank Knight in Chicago in the 1920s, who's a kind of neoclassical economist who sort of argued that under conditions of risk, you essentially have something that can be calculated. There's a kind of range of possibilities that you can assess that kind of gives you a clear sense of what might happen. In this image, I mean, it's clear that the downside of this sort of motorcyclist behavior is serious injury or death, but it's not going to trigger some kind of world-changing calamity, right? It's kind of limited to his own or her own injury and whatnot, and maybe of somebody around them or whatnot. Uncertainty involves kind of something that just cannot be calculated, at least not in the same ways that risk can be. And so in conditions of uncertainty, the kind of downsides of what might occur, as well as the upsides in a particular situation are much less clear because of the kinds of things that can enter into relationships with the process that's going on. And here it's an image of a methane crater in Siberia that they started appearing a few years ago. And I kind of bring it up because it's kind of part of a wider system of not just global warming, but some people have kind of started calling it global weirding, which means that we don't know the kinds of feedback loops that might be created given our like current actions. We don't know exactly what will enter into relationship with what else. There's plenty of stuff that might be unexpected that gets triggered because there's a tight coupling that we didn't realize at a particular moment. And it doesn't mean that you don't like think through these kinds of questions scientifically. If anything, it means that you need to think of them more from that perspective to try to unearth what the potential causal links are. But at the present moment, there's just a limit in how much we can know about how things interact. And why does this matter for strategic foresight, which is an approach to kind of making decisions for organizations? Partly because all the tools that we have for making decisions are really based on these kind of more deterministic models, these more models that are more kind of assumed to be complicated. And so the approach that you take in something like this is usually you try to analyze the components, right? You break them down, the piston, the spark plug, whatever, the injector valve. You try to predict how they're going to act, and then you try to plan on the basis of like how you understand this thing acting. And so we have a lot of tools in organizations, in policymaking, to kind of think through the consequences of our designs from the perspective of like a more deterministic model. And I think you can think about the limits of this in a lot of ways. If anyone's worked in an organization that produces a roadmap, I mean, one of the ironies of a roadmap is that nothing is more certain than a roadmap becoming kind of irrelevant in a year or two, just because of how much things change, how things don't work out as you expected, and how much you have to adapt on the basis of changes both within yourself and within the environment. And so the kind of plan that you determined, 3 years out is clearly going to be shifting in a lot of ways. And that's not to say that this approach isn't useful. It's just that it's one approach that can be integrated with other kinds of approaches. So the other kinds of approaches that come more from this sort of strategic foresight or design perspective, I think are geared towards helping us make sense of things that operate under more uncertain and complex interactions. And here, an approach to kind of making sense of what the system does is to not assume that you know what it is. You kind of have to probe it. You have to send something out to figure out what it's doing. You have to kind of assess and sense what happens when you probe it. And then you have to figure out what your response to that might be. And that's partly because these systems are changing. They involve all sorts of open connections to other processes that are going on in the world. And so you need something of a more kind of nimble or agile approach to the situation, something from which it helps if you think that you're kind of more maybe embedded within the system. You don't necessarily have the greatest overview of this thing as a whole. You kind of are acting within it and seeing what it does. And if anybody's like aware of the kind of Silicon Valley approach to launching products like under the banner of like agile processes, I think you'll sort of see some parallels in this probe, sense, respond notion, which is that in the agile approach, you'll launch like a minimal viable product, right? You won't fully plan out exactly what it's going to do. You'll sense what it does to the environment, and then you'll kind of adapt and respond on the basis of what it does once you put it out into the world. And so that's one example of how you can go about engaging with a more kind of quote complex, uncertain system. But another way to do that is the kind of approach that comes from speculative design, which I mentioned earlier. I mean, all design is speculative. It has to be because it's introducing something that wasn't there before in the world. But the kind of more narrowly defined speculative design of the kind that exists in like the work of I guess Dunn and Raby, which was mentioned in another by Lisa, is kind of this more constrained vision of what speculation means. And I think it can be a very useful way to kind of test drive futures and try to understand what these complex systems might do through a kind of speculative imaginative act. Because what it does is it actually makes quite concrete the things that what we imagine the system might do, right? Because we're always operating on assumed models of how the relations of a system actually are structured. And so we can kind of test that imaginatively in this kind of, quote, maybe you could call this a sandbox approach that involves a kind of leap towards, maybe we could call it synthetic evidence, right? So it's not necessarily the kind of inductive evidence that Gleb was talking about, but it's actually a more synthetic form of evidence that relies on our intuitions and our underlying kind of models that can be quite rigorous in how we understand how the world might work. And I think a way to think about this too is maybe like think of it as a form of test driving. So if you're trying to figure out how to drive a car, the kind of approach that just gives you a list of like things that you have to do in order to get this car to move, it might be helpful for just kind of orienting you within the vehicle, but it's not going to teach you how to drive. Because what goes on when you drive is a much more sort of complex like interaction between a body and an environment, right? And so it's the feedback of when you change the shifter, right, which makes you feel the engine. It's the way that the sort of grip of the tires on the road makes you understand how to pull the wheel back and forth. And so it's like speculative design to me is maybe akin to thinking of like test driving some of these possible things that we want to introduce into complex systems. And just imaginatively try to lay out what are the kinds of ways that it might react and what it might do and whatnot. And so it becomes a way to kind of make concrete something that is a speculative abstraction. And that's it. I'm not going to show any examples, but I can share work that we've done at our collective that fits a little bit into this model. I'll actually share something right now in the chat where we did a kind of series of like audio speculative scenarios that was based on an understanding of we kind of laid out what the emerging affordances of the future of work might look like. We've done this in collaboration with the startup in Toronto. And so we laid out a series of things that we imagined that were actually sort of pragmatically changing the possibilities of what work might look like and what kinds of affordances might be used within work contexts and what kinds of goals work could be organized around achieving. And then we did a series of speculative scenarios that kind of test drive what we thought of as those kind of pragmatic affordances and whatnot. And so that's it. I'm excited to have a conversation.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So we will actually, so please post the link to the chat and so everybody can see them. So each roundtable we start with, I will be reading a small paragraph from a book to stimulate the conversation. And since Valdis was, actually I prepared another paragraph from Jane Jacobs, but since Valdis was talking about complex system, I actually have found one that's more controversial and is thinking of system study. It's actually by Norbert Wiener, as you were saying, like system study originated mostly from 1950. So this is a very in-time book, Human Use of Human Being. And I chose it because I feel like some of the circumstances the scientists have described is still the same as we have today. And I'll be posting the first question after the passage. Okay, so here goes Wiener. He said that accordingly, many of those who are most attached to the orderly state of permanently allocated functions would be confounded if they were forced to admit this publicly. They are only in a position to display their clear preferences through their actions, yet these actions stand out distinctly enough. For instance, the businessman who separates himself from his employees by a shield of yes men, or the head of a big laboratory who assign each subordinate a particular problem and begrudge him the privilege of thinking about the problem himself, so that he can move beyond his immediate problem and perceive its general relevance. This shows that the democracy to which they pay their respect is not really the order in which they would prefer to live. So the regularly ordered state of pre-assigned functions towards which they gravitate is suggestive of the Leibniz automata and does not suggest the irreversible movement into a contingent future, which is the true condition of human life. And then he goes on to saying, in an ant community, each worker performs its proper functions. There are many there may be a separate castle of soldiers. Certain highly specialized individuals perform the functions of kings and queens. If man were to adopt this community as a pattern, he would live in a fascist state in which ideally each individual is conditioned from birth for his proper occupation, in which rulers are permanently rulers, soldiers perpetually soldiers, and peasant is never more than a peasant, and the worker is doomed to be a worker. I think this paragraph is especially relevant in today's interdisciplinary study, where there's like this wall between different disciplines that do not communicate. And it's especially interesting because he's referencing the ant community as, you know, a self-organizational community, but at the same time, there's a permanent structuralist approach to how we should be organizing social order. So my first question is, you know, it seems like top-down and bottom approaches, complexity and self-organization seems to be antagonistic with each other, especially in today's geopolitics. Seems like these systems can never synthesize, or if you talk about one to another, it's almost like there is not an understanding that coming across, especially, you know, Lisa and Gleb, you're now in Hong Kong, and then Valdis was in Canada. We were all in Moscow. How do you see that, maybe through speculative design or not, that these kind of top-down, bottom-up, centralized, decentralized can actually be synthesized into, you know, communication and maybe a new democracy that comes out, which, you know, can have more choices beside one man, one vote to encompass other systems of order? Oof.
Tough one.
Tough. Yeah, that was the purpose.
I think I can start if we don't have an order or anything.
No, there's no order. Everyone is welcome to join. Actually, you can just turn on your camera and start speaking.
All right. So speaking of the